For well over a century, one of the most stubborn arguments in Balkan history has centered on a single, deceptively simple question. Where did the Albanians actually come from? One side of the argument insists Albanians are the direct unbroken descendants of the ancient Illyrians, an indigenous Balkan people who were already living in the region thousands of years before Rome, Slavic tribes, or the Ottoman Empire ever arrived. The other side has argued at various points, and for various reasons, some scholarly and some openly political, that Albanian identity formed considerably later, shaped by later migrations rather than unbroken ancient continuity. This was never a purely academic disagreement confined to university departments. It has been tangled up for generations with modern territorial disputes, competing national narratives, and the kind of historical argument that gets invoked in political speeches, not just history journals. In 2026, a team of geneticists finally brought the one kind of evidence that does not care about any of that politics directly into the argument: ancient and modern DNA, sequenced and compared at a scale nobody had previously attempted. And what they found gives one of the clearest, most scientifically grounded answers this specific debate has ever received. To understand why this question carries so much weight, you have to understand what was actually being argued about. The Illyrians were a group of Indo-European-speaking tribes who inhabited the Western Balkans in territory covering much of modern Albania, Kosovo, Montenegro, and parts of the former Yugoslavia, for well over 1,000 years before Rome eventually conquered the region in a series of wars during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. They are known today mainly through Greek and Roman-written sources, along with a growing body of archaeological evidence, including fortified hilltop settlements, distinctive metalwork, and burial practices, and a scattering of place names and personal names preserved in later inscriptions. What happened to the Illyrians and their descendants after Roman conquest, and later after the collapse of Roman authority in the region, and the arrival of Slavic-speaking peoples starting in the 6th and 7th centuries CE, became one of the central unresolved questions in southeastern European history. Albanians themselves first appear clearly in written historical sources only around the 11th century CE, which left a genuine, centuries-wide gap in the documentary record between the last clear references to Illyrian populations in antiquity and the first clear references to Albanians in the medieval period. Historians, linguists, and nationalist writers on multiple sides spent much of the 19th and 20th centuries trying to fill that gap, often reaching sharply different conclusions depending on which side of a modern political border and which modern political argument they happened to be writing from. In 2026, a major international research team, led by geneticist Leonidas Romanos Devranoglu at the University of Oxford, and including researchers from Albania, Greece, Hungary, and elsewhere, finally applied large-scale genome sequencing directly to the question and published their results in the journal Nature Human Behaviour. The scale of the study is genuinely significant in its own right. The team analyzed more than 6,000 ancient genomes gathered from across Western Eurasia, alongside 74 newly collected DNA samples from ethnic Albanians, specifically chosen to represent all of the major Albanian dialect groups rather than sampling from just one region or community. That kind of broad, deliberately representative sampling matters enormously for a question like this, since a narrower study drawing only from one part of the Albanian-speaking world could easily produce a skewed or unrepresentative picture of the population as a whole. What the research found was about as clear an answer as ancient DNA analysis is ever able to deliver for a question this historically contested. Modern Albanians trace a substantial share of their ancestry directly back to Bronze and Iron Age populations of the Western Balkans, precisely the populations historically associated with the Illyrians. Even more strikingly, the researchers were able to identify a small, specific ancestral population that appears to have already been living in the territory of modern Albania as early as 800 to 900 CE, centuries before Albanians as a distinct group ever appear in written historical records, and this early medieval population shows a clear, direct genetic link to many present-day Albanians. In other words, the genetic evidence effectively closes much of the historical documentary gap that had fueled so much of the earlier academic uncertainty by showing a population already established, genetically continuous, and recognizably ancestral to modern Albanians, sitting right in the middle of the centuries where written sources go quiet. The single most striking part of the findings involves exactly how much of that ancient ancestry survived intact, and what makes it stand out is the direct comparison against neighboring Balkan populations facing the exact same historical circumstances. Between the 6th and 9th centuries CE, a massive wave of Slavic-speaking migration swept across large parts of southeastern Europe, fundamentally reshaping the population, language, and culture of much of the Balkan Peninsula. The genetic impact of that migration wave was enormous almost everywhere it reached. According to the research, neighboring populations in modern Croatia, Montenegro, and Serbia absorbed somewhere between 40 and 86% Eastern European Slavic-related ancestry during this migration period, a genuinely massive demographic transformation reshaping the genetic makeup of those regions within a few centuries. Albanian ancestors, by sharp contrast, absorbed considerably less Slavic-related ancestry during that same period, averaging somewhere between just 10 and 20%. The areas showing the highest concentrations of that later Slavic admixture were specifically located along the Albanian-Montenegrin border and in northeastern Albania, precisely the regions where documented, sustained Albanian Slavic linguistic and cultural contact lasted longest historically, meaning even the modest admixture that did occur maps cleanly onto known historical contact zones rather than appearing randomly scattered across the population. That comparative pattern is really the heart of the entire scientific story, and it is worth sitting with directly, because it explains something genuinely unusual about Albanian population history relative to the rest of the Balkans. While most of southeastern Europe experienced a demographic transformation during the early medieval Slavic migrations, dramatic enough to fundamentally reshape the genetic profile of the region, the ancestors of modern Albanians appear to have weathered that same historical upheaval while retaining a meaningfully larger share of their older pre-Slavic Balkan ancestry. Researchers estimate that early medieval Albanians preserved somewhere between roughly 68 and 84% of that older, ancient Balkan ancestral component, a level of genetic continuity considerably higher than what shows up in most neighboring populations from the same historical period. This does not mean Albanian ancestors somehow avoided contact with incoming Slavic populations entirely, since the 10 to 20% admixture that the research did detect is real and geographically consistent with documented historical contact. It means that whatever specific combination of geography, settlement pattern, language retention, and social structure shaped this particular corner of the Balkans, it resulted in comparatively less large-scale genetic replacement than what happened almost everywhere else across the wider region during the same turbulent centuries. Alongside this major academic study sits a separate, complementary body of research worth understanding on its own terms, precisely because it comes from a very different kind of scientific effort. The Albanian DNA Project, sometimes referred to by the name ROOTS, is a large citizen science initiative that has collected Y chromosome data from more than 1,300 voluntary Albanian participants across every Albanian inhabited region, comparing these modern paternal lineages against the wider ancient DNA record from across the Balkans and Europe. It is important to be clear that this specific project operates differently from a formal, peer-reviewed academic study like the 2026 Nature Human Behaviour paper, relying on voluntary public contributions rather than a tightly controlled academic sampling design, which means its findings should be treated as a useful, broadly informative complement to the peer-reviewed research rather than as an equivalent, independently verified scientific authority in its own right. With that caveat clearly in mind, the patterns this project has reported line up reasonably well with the more rigorous academic findings. Roughly 10 distinct Y chromosome haplogroups account for close to 95% of all Albanian paternal lineages sampled, and the project's analysis identifies 3 broad historical layers: a small Neolithic farming component making up under 4% of lineages, tracing back to the very earliest agricultural populations that reached the Balkans over 4,000 years ago, a dominant Bronze Age and Iron Age component, making up somewhere around 72 to 77%, associated specifically with ancient Balkan populations, including the Illyrians and the closely related Dardanians, and a smaller later contribution of roughly 16 to 19%, dating to late antiquity and the early medieval period, and reflecting subsequent Germanic, Slavic, and other historical migrations into the region. One particularly interesting genetic thread running through this research involves a specific Y chromosome subclade known as haplogroup EV13, which shows up at meaningful frequency across the Balkans generally, and at notably higher levels in populations, ancient and modern, associated with the Western and Central Balkan region specifically. Ancient DNA researchers have traced this same lineage into some genuinely unexpected historical contexts, including among mercenary soldiers buried at the site of Himera in Sicily, warriors who appear, based on their genetic profile, to have originated from the Central Balkan zone where ancient Illyrian and Thracian-related populations historically overlapped and had ongoing contact with one another, evidence of just how far Balkan populations and their genetic lineages traveled through ancient trade and military networks well beyond the region most people associate with them today. An even more striking connection involves a related Y chromosome lineage, haplogroup J2BL283, found both in ancient DNA recovered from within Illyrian territory and, remarkably, in ancient remains belonging to the Messapian people of what is now southern Italy, a population whose language has long been suspected by historical linguists to be closely related to Illyrian, based on inscriptions and place names alone, long before any genetic evidence existed to test that specific relationship directly. Finding the same distinctive Y chromosome lineage on both sides of the Adriatic Sea offers a rare case where genetic evidence and an old, previously unconfirmed linguistic hypothesis actually reinforce each other directly. The linguistic side of this same debate deserves its own explanation, because it ran in parallel with the historical argument for well over a century and shaped how many people already expected the genetic story to turn out. Albanian occupies a genuinely unusual position within the Indo-European language family. Unlike English, French, or Russian, which each belong to large, well-populated branches of that family alongside many close linguistic relatives, Albanian stands almost entirely alone, forming its own single, independent branch of Indo-European with no other closely related living language anywhere on Earth. That isolation has made Albanian one of the most difficult languages in Europe to trace back to a specific ancient source using linguistic evidence alone, and it fueled the same basic argument that played out in the historical record. Some linguists proposing Albanian descends directly from the ancient Illyrian language, attested only in scattered place names and personal names from antiquity. Others arguing for a connection to the Thracian or Dacian languages spoken further east and north, and still others treating the question as fundamentally unresolvable, given how little direct written evidence survives of any of these ancient Balkan languages. The discovery of shared Y chromosome lineages between ancient Illyrian territory and the Messapian population of southern Italy, whose language had already been linked to Illyrian on linguistic grounds alone, offered one of the first genuinely independent pieces of evidence supporting one specific side of that older linguistic argument. Precisely because genetics and historical linguistics were, in this instance, developed as completely separate lines of evidence before ever being compared against each other directly. It would be dishonest to present this entire topic as a purely neutral, apolitical, scientific curiosity, and responsible coverage of it has to acknowledge that directly. The question of Albanian indigeneity in the Balkans has been entangled for well over a century, with real, ongoing political disputes in the region, including arguments over Kosovo, where competing historical narratives about which population has the deeper, more legitimate claim to specific territory have been invoked at various points to support very different political positions. Older counterarguments proposing that Albanians migrated into the region relatively late, rather than descending directly from ancient Illyrian populations, have sometimes been advanced for genuinely scholarly reasons rooted in the incomplete historical record, but have also, at other points, been advanced for openly nationalist and political reasons connected to modern territorial claims rather than historical accuracy alone. Genetic evidence of the kind produced by this 2026 study cannot and was never going to resolve modern political disputes over borders, sovereignty, or territorial legitimacy, which are fundamentally questions of law, politics, and international agreement, rather than questions a genome sequencer can answer. What the research can responsibly speak to is the narrower specific historical and biological question of population continuity, and on that specific question, the genetic evidence now points fairly clearly towards substantial, measurable continuity between ancient Western Balkan populations and the Albanian population living in that same region today. Put the complete picture together, and the current evidence-based answer to where Albanians actually came from looks like this. Modern Albanians carry a substantial, well-documented genetic connection to Bronze and Iron Age populations of the Western Balkans, the same broad population historically identified as Illyrian by Greek and Roman writers more than 2,000 years ago. That ancestral population was already established in the territory of modern Albania by at least the early medieval period, sometime around 800 to 900 CE, well before Albanians as a distinct named group first appear clearly in written historical records roughly 2 centuries later. And unlike almost every other population across the wider Balkan region, Albanian ancestors experienced comparatively limited genetic disruption during the massive Slavic migrations that reshaped the demographic makeup of most of southeastern Europe between the 6th and 9th centuries, retaining a meaningfully larger share of their older, pre-medieval Balkan ancestry than their neighbors in modern Croatia, Serbia, and Montenegro did across that same turbulent historical period. None of this settles every open question in Balkan history, and no single genetic study, however large and well-designed, was ever going to. But after well over a century of argument, conducted mostly through historical inference, linguistic reconstruction, and all too often, openly political motivation, this is the first time the debate over Albanian origins has been tested directly and at real scale against the genome itself, and the genome has, for now, given one of the clearest answers this particular centuries-old argument has ever received. If a story like this, where a genuinely old and often politically fraught historical argument finally gets tested directly against the genome, is the kind that stays with you, stay close, because ancient DNA research keeps working through exactly these kinds of long-contested population questions all across Europe and beyond. And if there is a specific people, region, or ancestry debate you have always wanted properly examined through the actual evidence, leave it in the comments, because that is precisely where the next story, like this one, tends to come from.